By now, our friend Father Michael Ciccone is back at the Josephinum in Ohio in full swing with all of the seminarians. But we enjoy having him here in the summertime. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but while he's here, he is writing a book. And the book that he's writing is on the Beatitudes. And so one day this past summer, he said to me, I'd like to have you come out to my place so that we can talk about specifically the beatitude of poverty of the spirit. And he said, specifically what I'd like you to think about and pray about is what that would look like in the life of the priest who celebrates that threefold office of the priesthood of shepherd, teacher, and sanctifier. And so I prayed about that, and I thought about it, and what came to me was an image. And the image that came to me was the image of Pope Francis. If you remember, shortly after being elected to the papacy, he came out on the balcony at the Vatican. And he just stood there, just looking. And all of a sudden, he said, Buenos Aires, good afternoon. And then he asked the people to do something. He asked the people if they would pray for him and bless him. And he bowed down. Do you know why he bowed? He bowed to the dignity that he recognized in them. He bowed to their human dignity. And then they prayed with him. And then he blessed them. And to me, that is the perfect image of what Jesus describes today in the gospel with regards to being humble. To be humble means to recognize the God-given dignity in every living person. To recognize the dignity in every living thing. And to approach that dignity in the same manner that we approach the dignity of God. If you listen carefully to the second reading, it's one of my favorites that comes from the book of Hebrews. It talks about the people, the saints, the people of God, approaching, and it references back to Exodus when the people were afraid to approach the mountain of God because they saw all of the lightning and heard all of the peals of thunder. And so the author of Hebrews is saying that we are approaching something much greater than that. We are approaching, he says, the living God, where countless of festal angels are gathered together. And the saints of God, the entire celestial court of angels and saints are gathered. What he's describing is what we approach every single time we come to the celebration of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. We are approaching the living God. And Pope Francis was bowing to the dignity of people that he saw because he understood that the living God made his presence and made his abode within them. And so he bowed to their dignity. And they bowed back. Make no mistake about it, my brothers and sisters, it is always, always, always about the relationship between you and I, or you and the person sitting next to you, or you and the person at home, or you and the person that you live next to, or you and the person that you work with. It is always going to be about the relationship. And if we can remember that and we make it about the relationship and we remember the dignity of the person, we can settle anything. We can forgive anything. And so Jesus today reminds us that we have to be careful how we choose our seat. We have to be careful how we choose our seat. But I think it's important also to remember and to say that the last seat is not a back seat. Listen to what Pope Francis recently said with regards to last seats and back seats. He said it is an illusion that being compliant and socially appropriate equate to being a good Christian. Think about that. Being a yes man and being socially appropriate isn't necessarily, he's saying, the criteria for being a good Christian. Pope Francis in June of this year warned followers not to allow Christianity to become a school of superficial niceness. He described this false understanding as liquid Christianity, a concept without substance that favors a love for external appearance rather than a love for Christ. Sometimes, while it might be the best thing to do to keep my mouth shut in order not to make any waves, he's saying that that kind of a passive nature is not necessarily making me a good Christian. It's not a good Christian witness. You'll see what he says. Many followers, not wanting to add to the tide of Catholic negativity, have sidestepped any stance that may be considered confrontational or provocative, to the point of watering down or even misrepresenting God's truth. This is effectively the choice to hide behind a cloak of submissiveness and drift passively along rather than making any waves. If I don't make any waves and I keep quiet and I mind my own business, then things will be okay for me. But that's not necessarily the case. We have embraced teachings such as turn the other cheek and the meek shall inherit the earth to justify a stance of submissiveness rather than incorporating them into a broader context of Christ's call to realign the world to his Father's will. Christianity is not for sissies. There is nothing passive about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Christ's call to meekness is a practical instruction not to return evil with evil, and also a spiritual call to be pliable to God's will rather than the ways of the world. But it is not an invitation for Christians to become defenseless punching bags. And all too often, that's what we are. You see the outcry when Muhammad is blasphemed. And I'm not advocating violence. But where is the outcry from Christians every time the name of Jesus Christ is blasphemed? And not only his name dragged through the mud, but all of our Christian symbols. The Blessed Mother. Where is the Christian outcry? In an environment where criticism toward the church has become a secular pastime, however, it is far more comfortable for Christians to take a passive and non-confrontational approach than to stand firm on the foundational truths we have inherited. It's easy to keep quiet. Easy. Because it doesn't draw any attention to myself. It doesn't open the door to persecution and people giving me a hard time, or people disliking me because I'm standing up for the truth. We seem to believe that remaining socially polite and not offending others is more Christian than passionately defending what we know to be true. But it is certainly not the stance adopted by Jesus Christ, our founder. Jesus may have been meek and submissive when it came to the will of the Father, but he was certainly not fearful or hesitant to confront or challenge sin in all of its forms. We sometimes forget that Jesus emptied the temple and he drove them out with a whip. We forget that Jesus righteously got angry at the Pharisees and at anyone who would turn his Father's house into a marketplace. We seem to forget that Jesus stood in the face of accusation when they wanted to stone the woman who was caught in the act of adultery and said, "You who haven't committed sin, be the first to cast a stone." He wasn't afraid to stand for the truth. He wasn't afraid to confront hypocrisy or false idolatry and false worship. Yes, my brothers and sisters, Jesus taught us how to bow to one another's dignity, to recognize that the dignity that we possess is God-given. And because it is God-given, it cannot be taken away. It should never, ever, ever be maligned by anyone. And that when we see that happening, we need to stand up and say, "That's not right. It isn't right." That's humility. That's humility. To recognize who God is and to recognize who we are and why that is an eternal truth and where that comes from. No, my brothers and sisters, the last seat is not the back seat.